All right, so we are continuing our final unit of the school year, which is on counting and probability. In the last video, we introduced the idea of probability, specifically that probability is calculated using a fraction, where you find the number of outcomes that you're looking for, the number of desirable outcomes, the number of outcomes that are of interest. You find that number, and then you divide it by the number of total possible outcomes, good and bad, whether you want them or don't want them, doesn't matter. And that basic fraction is the way then that we calculate probabilities. And that fraction will be true for every probability that we calculate in this entire unit. But what we're going to start looking at in the next couple of videos are ways to find out how many outcomes are possible. So when we say figure out the number of desirable outcomes, in the last video, we looked at very simple things where we could just count. Well, I'm rolling a die. I'm trying to figure out how many ways can I get an even number on the die. Well, there's 3 even numbers, 2 and 4 and 6, and so the answer is 3. And I literally just count those. But now we're going to start looking at other methods that we can do that will enable us to find larger numbers of outcomes without having to literally count them. Because many times we will find there's hundreds or thousands, even millions and billions of potential outcomes to a problem, and counting them literally becomes impossible. So that is the purpose of this. We're going to look at our first method, and it's called the fundamental counting principle. So with that introduction, let's get started. Only one learning objective here, and it's simply to be able to use the fundamental counting principle. Now, of course, to know how and when to use it, we need to know what it is, and we need to know what sort of restrictions or limitations are placed upon it. I will say, as a quick little side note as we get started here, one of the most challenging parts of calculating probabilities is knowing when you can use each of the different methods we're going to learn. So let's start by talking about when you can use fundamental counting principle. So fundamental counting principle, we're going to write down 2 facts here. Principle, sorry. We're going to write down 2 facts. Fact number 1 is when you can use this. Okay, so we will use fundamental counting principle when there are multiple events in our story. Okay, so when I say story, it's whatever it is that we're describing. Okay, so if the story is I'm rolling a die, okay, that's my story. How many events are in that story? Well, there's just one. I rolled a die. Okay, no big deal. So we're going to use when there's multiple events. And okay, both of these things, it's got to be both of them. We're going to use when there's multiple events and all of the events occur. Okay, now what do I mean by that? So let's take the rolling a die example. If I'm trying to find the number of ways that I can roll one die and get an even number, okay, there's only one event, fundamental counting principle doesn't matter. But if I'm trying to find the number of ways that I can roll the die twice and get an even number, now all of a sudden, my total number of outcomes, or I'm sorry, my total number of events has changed. I'm not just one event anymore, I'm 2 events. I'm rolling the die twice. So notice there's one story, you're rolling dice. But in that story, there's 2 events. I roll the dice once, I roll the dice a second time. So that's what I mean by 2 events. And it has to be the case that all of the events occur. So if you read a problem and it says you roll the die and you get even numbers on both rolls or something like that, that's one thing. But if it's something where you see the word or popping in, like you roll the die and you get a 1 or you get a 2. You get a 1 on the first roll or you get a 2 on the second roll or something like that. When you see that word or, that's an indicator that not the event that's being described doesn't have to happen every time. I just have to have one or the other of the events happen. So when you see that word or, fundamental counting principle probably is not going to be the method you're going to use. We're looking for situations where we want all of the events to occur. All right, so let's take a look at, oh, I forgot to write the second bullet point. Second bullet point is how to use it. How to use. Okay, and the easiest way to talk about how to use is to start by writing down what the fundamental counting principle says, and then to do an example of it. So here's what it says. Fundamental accounting principle says to find the total number of outcomes, multiply the number of outcomes, there we go. Multiply the number of outcomes from each event. Okay, to find the total number of outcomes, find the multiply the number of outcomes from each event. Okay, this product will equal the total number of outcomes. This product will equal the total number of outcomes. Okay, so here's the scenario. I have multiple events happening. All of them are going to happen every single time. So what I want to do is I want to figure out how many ways can event number 1 happen? How many ways can event number 2 happen? How many ways can event number 3 happen? I'm going to do that for every event in my story. And once I know how many ways each one of those events can happen, then I'm going to multiply all those numbers together. That will give me the total number of events. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here's example number 1. Perhaps one of the most famous type of examples of this sort of problem. I'm going to make a sandwich. Okay, when I make my sandwich, at this particular place where I'm making it, maybe it's in my kitchen, maybe it's at a restaurant, maybe at Subway, whatever it is, I'm given the option of 2 types of bread. So I can have white or I can have wheat. Okay, I'm going to choose one of them. Okay, I'm also given the option of 3 kinds of meats. Again, I'm going to choose one of them. Right? I'm given the option of 2 types of cheese. I'm going to choose one. And let's just call that good for now. Okay, so there's my sandwich. 2 kinds of bread, 3 kinds of meat, 2 kinds of cheese. All right, so to make this sandwich, notice it's saying that I'm going to choose one of each. So this, if we were going to think of it as a story, the story might go like this. You go to your kitchen. In the kitchen, you find that you've got 2 kinds of bread, 3 kinds of meat, and 2 kinds of cheese. You're going to choose one of each of those things to make a sandwich. How many possible sandwiches could you make? So maybe you can make white bread with ham and American cheese, or wheat bread with ham and American cheese, or white bread with turkey and provolone cheese, or whatever. So there's all these different kinds of sandwiches that I could potentially make. The question becomes how many? So when you're doing a fundamental accounting principle, the first thing is to recognize, do you have multiple events? And in this story, I do. Every time I choose something, that is an event. So I've got event number 1. I've got event number 2. I've got event number 3. So every time I choose something, I have an event. This particular story is made up of 3 events. Notice it says that I'm choosing one. It doesn't give me the option of saying, oh, I'm just not going to have bread. That's not an option. I have to choose one of each. So I have 3 events, and all 3 events are going to occur. Once I make the mental connection that that's what's happening in the story, that tells me use fundamental accounting principle. So the way that I set this up, once I know I've got fundamental accounting principle, the way that I set this up is I write a blank for each event that I'm working with. So here's event number 1, event number 2, and here's event number 3. Right? So I just make a blank for each event. And then what I do is I fill that blank in with the number of different outcomes for that event. So when I choose bread, well, I could choose white bread or I could choose wheat bread. That's 2 different options, 2 different outcomes. So 2 is how many different outcomes I have from my first event. Choosing a type of meat, well, I could choose ham, or I could choose turkey, or I could choose salami. That's 3 different outcomes, whether I get ham or turkey or salami. So how many different outcomes do I have to event number 3? There's 3 of them. I'm sorry, event number 2. There's 3 of them. And last but not least, I've got 2 options for cheese. I could choose an American cheese or I could choose provolone cheese. Those are my 2 options. So how many different kinds of cheese could I have? How many outcomes could I have from event number 3? When I'm done choosing my 3, either American or provolone, those are my only options. There's 2 possible outcomes. So that's the way that I would set up my problem. Now, the fundamental accounting principle tells me that the total number of outcomes, in this case, total number of sandwiches, the total number of sandwiches will be these multiplied together. So that's what I do to finish. 2 times 3 equals 6, and then 6 times 2 equals 12. So under these conditions, there's 12 different sandwiches that I could possibly make. And that's the example of a fundamental accounting principle type of problem. Okay, let's consider this, for example. Example number 2. All right, so let's suppose that I've got a deck of cards. We've learned in a previous video that a deck of cards has 52 cards in it. We're going to select 5 cards from the deck. We're going to select 5 cards from the deck. When we do that, we are not going to put the cards back in the deck. So the way that we typically describe that is we say it's without replacements. Okay, so once I pick a card from the deck, I'm going to keep the card. I'm going to hold on to it. I'm not going to replace it. I'm not going to put it back in the deck. Select 5 cards. Oops, sorry. Select 5 cards from the deck without replacements. Okay. How many different ways can I do this? Okay, so maybe the first time the deck's not shuffled or anything like that, and so I pick the ace of spades, the 2 of spades, the 3 of spades, the 4 of spades, and the 5 of spades. Boom. Now somebody shuffles it. This time I get the 2 of spades, the ace of spades, the 5 of clubs, the king of diamonds, whatever. Okay, so you can see there's all these different options. How many different ways can I do this if I'm picking 5 cards from the deck without replacing them? Okay, so what I would do in this type of a problem is, again, recognize that there are multiple events. And this time I'm selecting 5 cards. So that's 5 different events. I select the first one, I select the second one, I select the third one, et cetera, et cetera. 5 different events. So I have 5 events, and all of them are happening. I'm going to pick 5 cards. Boom. It doesn't give me the option to say, you only have to pick 4 this time. I'm going to pick 5 cards. So as soon as I see I have multiple events and that all of them are happening, then I put down my little blanks, 1 for each event. Now, event number 1, if I'm picking 1 card out of a deck of 52, how many different ways could that go? Well, I could get the ace of spades, I could get the king of diamonds, I could get the queen of hearts, I could get, how many options are there? Well, there's 52 cards in the deck, so I've got 52 options. I could get any one of those cards. But once I've taken a card out of the deck, I'm not putting it back. Since I'm not putting it back, there's no longer 52 options anymore. The next time I pick the card, there's only 51 options because I didn't put the card back. And then the next time I pick, there's only 50 options because I've already taken 2 cards out. So now there's only 50. Now I've taken 3 cards out. So there's only 49 options. And then the last time, because I've already taken 4 cards out, there's only 48 options left. And so the number of ways that I could do this will be these 5 numbers multiplied together. So if I grab my calculator here real quick, 52 times 51 times 50 times 49 times 48. Looks like I'm going to have a lot of different ways. 311,875,200 different ways that I could pull cards from a deck. Pull 5 cards from the deck. Okay, so these are the types of problems that you're going to be working with fundamental accounting principle. Now, keep in mind, when you do these problems, you are setting this up where if it asks you to just simply find the number of ways, the number of sandwiches, whatever, you're setting it up just simply with a fundamental accounting problem just like this. You're going to get one number, one answer. That's the whole problem. You're done. But if the question asks you to find a probability, remember, for probability, now you have to get two numbers. One for the top of your fraction and one for the bottom of your fraction. Okay, number of desirable outcomes divided by total number of outcomes. So you're going to have to get two numbers. One thing to make sure you're clear on, and there will be later examples and later videos with this, but one thing to make sure you're clear on is just because you use fundamental counting principle for one doesn't necessarily mean that you'll use fundamental counting principle for the other. It's very possible that for one of them, you might literally just count. Or once we've learned other types of methods, like combinations and so forth, you might use fundamental counting principle for one, but a combination for the other, or something like that. Okay, so keep that in mind. When you're doing probabilities, these are really two separate problems. And then once you've got those two answers, you're just going to divide it. So that takes care of the video on fundamental counting principle. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.